Hello, I'm Zola Levitt. The special program you're about to see concerns the most holy, most valuable real estate on earth. We hope as you watch this program you'll gain a new insight into the history of this site, its people, and its prophetic future.
Jerusalem and its Temple Mount, holy ground to Jews, Arabs, and Christians. The Bible cites this as the resting place of the God of the universe. Yet the history here, held within ancient stones of times past, has made these 35 acres a center of contention for nearly 3,000 years. Here at the Western, or Wailing Wall, David Rubinger captures moments of time with his camera. People come here to pray, to meditate, to weep. It was here on June 7th, 1967, that David took one of the most famous pictures ever recorded on film. Israeli paratroopers had just recaptured the Temple Mount.
In order to get this kind of picture with anything of the wall in it, I had to lie down on the ground to shoot it, because I want to have a little bit of some of the stones. So I shot that picture, never knowing that it was going to become an icon.
According to the Bible, this site first became significant in the story of Abraham and Isaac. It was here, in approximately 2000 BC, that Abraham climbed to the top of the mountain to offer his son on a sacrificial altar before the Lord. This is the remarkable account of the holiest place on earth. This is the story of the Temple of God. Here in Orlando, Florida, at the site of a recently constructed facsimile of the temple, Zola Levitt.
You know, in this world we have some very important buildings. The Eiffel Tower, the Taj Mahal, the Statue of Liberty, Wall of China. But no people has related to a construction longer than the Jewish people to their temple site, their Temple Mount. A 3,000-year relationship.
Jerusalem, the city of gold. Here at the southern wall of the Temple Mount, world-renowned archaeologist Dan Bahat descends the steps of the site that he has studied for 25 years. Each step is a reminder of the biblical prophets and kings who have called this place the Mountain of the Lord, Mount Moriah.
This mountain was a place where, in the 23rd century BC, which is about 4,300 years ago, some burial caves were excavated into the ground. Those burial caves are of special importance since they date from a time where tombs of patriarchs, of tribes, of clans, ancient ancestors were buried, and thus actually the place became sanctified. In other words, 500 years before Abraham, the period which is assumed to be of Abraham, 500 years beforehand, already the mountain became a holy mountain, and therefore we understand what is written in Genesis, saying that actually Abraham was shown the mountain by God when he took to sacrifice Isaac.
And they came to the place which God had told him of, and Abraham built an altar there, and laid the wood in order, and bound Isaac his son, and laid him on the altar upon the wood.
God would provide a ram as a substitute for the sacrifice. And the ram's horn, which had been caught in a thicket, would become the symbol of liberation throughout the ages to come. As seen from below in the Kidron Valley, the Temple Mount looks like this today. We know little of how it appeared before King David, but the book of Genesis tells us that in 1900 BC, King Melchizedek ruled the city of Salem. Nearly 1,000 years passed before David, in 990 BC, chose the site of a threshing floor on top of this mountain as the place for a future temple to the Lord. The owner of the site, Araunah the Jebusite, offered the site to David as a gift, but David refused.
I will surely buy it of thee at a price, neither will I offer burnt offerings unto the Lord my God of that which doth cost me nothing. So David bought the threshing floor and the oxen for 50 shekels of silver. And David built there an altar unto the Lord, and offered burnt offerings and peace offerings.
God had already proven himself to the children of Israel in their 40-year sojourn from Egypt to the Promised Land. The Ark of the Covenant would become the most treasured and sacred symbol of Jehovah's presence among them. It had traveled in a temporary place of worship, a tabernacle, but it would now find its way to a final resting place atop the mountain. David danced before the Lord as the procession snaked its way through the city to the mountain of the Lord. In time, David would seek a more pleasing house for his God. But the actual task of building the temple would be placed in the hands of his son, Solomon.
Arise, therefore, and build ye the sanctuary of the Lord God, to bring the ark of the covenant of the Lord and the holy vessels of God into the house that is to be built to the name of the Lord.
It took 7 years to build, 80,000 stonecutters, 3,300 foremen, and cedar wood brought all the way from Lebanon. Solomon covered the inside of the temple with pure gold. The magnificent structure consisted of a courtyard, a sanctuary, and an inner sanctuary called the Most Holy Place. The Ark of the Covenant would rest in the middle of this most holy room, just as it had in the tabernacle. And this would be God's dwelling place on planet Earth.
We believe that it was in the days of King Solomon when a city wall was built encircling Mount Moriah, and so actually the two parts of the city, namely the historical city of David and Mount Moriah, became one city till today.
The ruins of Solomon's Gate can still be seen, nestled within the archaeological excavations of the southern wall. Just a short distance away, the ruins of the city of David can also be seen, resting on the lower platform of a hill that stretches northward to the Temple Mount. The voices from Solomon's temple still echo through the corridors of time in this small ivory piece dated to the period of the First Temple, which reads, "Belonging to the temple of Yahweh, holy to the priests." And this letter, also dated to the period of Solomon's temple, contains one of the earliest references to the temple, or House of the Lord. Archaeologist Gabriel Barkay.
This southeastern corner is a crucial point in the Temple Mount. This was also a place where one of the pioneers of Jerusalem's archaeology, Charles Warren, in the 1860s carried out his pioneering excavations. Upon bedrock he found a rock bucket with an intact pottery vessel of First Temple period, of the 8th century BC. This is also very close to the place where he for the first time identified the royal seal impressions from the time of Hezekiah, king of Judah. So we have here intact layers of First Temple period underneath.
The temple came to be symbolic of the divinely granted nationhood of the Israelites. It would stand for 400 years before the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar, in 586 BC, would lay siege to Jerusalem and demolish the city. Ever since, the 9th of Av has been observed by Jews annually as a day of mourning. The children of Israel were taken captive to Babylon. For 70 years they would mourn for their promised land, and as they wept, their supplications to God were directed toward their holy city, Jerusalem. Such was the prayer of the prophet Daniel.
He went into his house, and his windows being open in his chamber toward Jerusalem, he knelt upon his knees 3 times a day, and prayed and gave thanks before his God, as he did aforetime.
There is a beautiful hymn in the Psalms about our tormentors demanding us on the rivers of Babylon to sing the songs of Zion. And then our forefathers said, no, we cannot sing. How can we sing the songs of Zion? And then they start singing. And the hymn is kind of an oath. Jews took an oath. If I forget you, O Jerusalem, let my right hand be forgotten.
The first subject when they came back from Babylon was to rebuild the temple.
Tuvia Sagiv is an Israeli architect who has studied the subject of the temple extensively.
In the beginning, some of the prophets came to them and say, how comes that you don't rebuild the temple? And rebuilding the temple was so important. And even Herod, who was not a Jew in his background, he understood how much is it important to enlarge the temple.
In the 1st century BC, Jerusalem was part of the Roman Empire. Herod the Great became the puppet king of Israel under the authority of Rome, and in 19 BC began his ambitious project of rebuilding the temple for the Jewish people. Lane Rittmeyer has researched the Temple Mount since 1973 and has written numerous books on Herod's temple.
Herod was motivated to make himself an everlasting name, as Josephus says. And his idea was to make the Temple Mount twice as large as before, so he extended it to the north and to the west and to the south.
Jewish historian Flavius Josephus, who lived during the time of the Second Temple, leaves us with this account of King Herod's remarkable building project.
Herod removed the old foundations. He laid new ones and raised the structure of hard white stones. A golden vine with grapes adorned the area below the cornice. Large porticos with 162 Corinthian columns surrounded the temple. It was supported by walls of immense size.
It took 76 years to build what would become known as the Second Temple. Upwards of 10,000 workmen at a time constructed the outer walls that supported an area of 35 acres. At the time of Jesus, the southern wall contained the main entrance gates to the temple.
What we see behind us is what we call the triple gate. This gate has got 3 entrances into a passage which is precisely built in the same manner as the double gate. And we believe that during the Second Temple period, it was double gate and not triple gate as it is now.
Just below the gates are the ritual baths known as mikvaot. These were used for cleansing purposes before ascending the steps and entering the temple area for worship.
So as we get here, we can see this decorated part which has got cornices and all kinds of incisions which form a part of the gate jump dated from Herod's time. And this is for us the proof that the gate is actually from Herod's time, because it continues with a very long course of stones which we call the master course, because it is so high, going all the way from here down to the floor. You see it is over my head even in the size.
The southwestern corner of the mount has provided numerous archaeological finds that date to the period of the Second Temple. One of the more fascinating is this stone, chiseled in Hebrew, which reads, "To the place of trumpeting." This stone fell from the top of the wall where it had marked the place for the priest to blow a trumpet announcing the beginning of Sabbath. This ossuary was used to store the bones of the dead in the 1st century. The inscription reads, "Simon, builder of the temple." Simon clearly thought it was an honor to be among the thousands who labored in the construction of the house of the Lord.
One can imagine going during the Second Temple period, going from here in, walking along a passage with steps all the way up to the surface of the Temple Mount, and you can imagine that thousands and thousands, Josephus Flavius speaks about millions of pilgrims coming all the way up to here, going through the gate and the double gate, going into the temple. Jesus was amongst them.
And in the daytime he was teaching in the temple, and at night he went out and abode in the mount that is called the Mount of Olives. And all the people came early in the morning to him in the temple for to hear him.
The magnificence of the temple has captivated the imagination of people for ages. Detailed models of the Temple Mount can now be found in Israel, England, and the United States. Recently, a theme park called the Holy Land Experience was opened in Orlando, Florida, featuring a reconstruction of 1st century Jerusalem. and hovering above it all, glistening white in the middle of the park, a facsimile of Herod's temple.
What attracts people to modern Israel and Jerusalem, of course, is more than buildings of stone and mortar. After all, God made his covenant here with the Jews 4,000 years ago, commanding Abraham to bring Isaac here and sacrifice him here. And of course, for Christian people, that the Son of God was sacrificed here. This is the very spot. And now, new believers come along in the 21st century, thousands of years later and thousands of miles away, and build a replica of the Temple of God in Jerusalem.
The founder-director of the Holy Land Experience, Marvin Rosenthal.
I happen to believe that the 35 or the 38 acres that make up the Temple Mount in Israel today is the most important piece of real estate in the world. I think that the so-called negotiations or peace talks between Yasser Arafat and the Prime Minister of Israel, in an ultimate sense, really isn't about the West Bank. It's not about the Gaza Strip. It's not about Bethlehem or Jericho. The real issue is who's going to control the Temple Mount.
Ask for our free monthly newsletter, The Levitt Letter, and our catalog with videos, books, and music. Our correspondence course, the Institute of Jewish Christian Studies, includes reading packets, teaching cassettes, and mail-in tests. Did you know that Zola takes tours to Israel, Greece, and the Holy Land Experience theme park in Orlando, Florida? Contact us for more information.
As magnificent as the stones were, as regal as were the royal chambers and gates that surrounded the Holy Temple, they would all fall, just as Jesus said.
And Jesus went out and departed from the temple, and his disciples came to him to show him the buildings of the temple. And Jesus said unto them, See ye not all these things? Verily I say unto you, there shall not be left here one stone upon another that shall not be thrown down.
The temple had been completed for only 6 years when it was totally destroyed by the Romans in 70 AD under the command of Titus. Josephus left an eyewitness report of the siege.
While the temple was in flames, the victors stole everything and slaughtered all who were caught. No pity was shown to age or rank. Old men, children, or priests, all were massacred. As the flames grew, and since the temple stood on a hill, it seemed as if the whole city was ablaze.
We've seen the evidence of the stones have been pushed down from the walls, from on top, and fallen down on the street. That's why we found the destroyed stones. But even so, all the stones that have been found don't account for 2% of all the structures that stood there. I believe that also in later periods, the Temple Mount was looted for stones. Half the old city is built of Temple Mount stones.
You know, one stress you don't often see in the news today about Israel is that the Jews have never been absent from the land, not for 3,500 years. There's no other people in the world that is that attached to their land in terms of people who have speaking the same language, worshiping the same God, singing the same songs, praying the same prayers. Even after 70 AD, when the Second Temple was destroyed, and there has not been another temple of God in Jerusalem in all that time, the Jews have never left the land. They established communities in Galilee, Tiberias, for example, and they stayed through the Middle Ages, the modern times, and have always been there, attached to the Promised Land.
The Western Wall stands as a holy memorial to what was the Western retaining wall of the Temple Mount. The stones, which can be seen today, are but a portion of the entire wall, which extends far below present ground level. In Temple times, it was 530 yards long. Many of the original Herodian stones still exist today, some weighing as much as 100 tons. Worshippers from around the world have made it a custom to write their prayers on pieces of paper and leave them in the cracks between the chiseled stones, the few stones that have survived the relentless siege of encroaching empires.
The total number of prisoners taken during the war was 97,000, and those who died during the siege 1,100,000. Jerusalem had been captured 5 times before and was now for the second time destroyed.
Titus and his soldiers had plundered the temple, taking everything that was holy to Rome. The money raised from the spoils may, in fact, have been the source of funding for the building of the Roman Colosseum. In 135 AD, the Emperor Hadrian built a pagan city on top of what remained of the Holy City, calling it Aelia Capitolina. Jews were barred from living in or even visiting the city. To add further insult to the Jews, Hadrian renamed the entire land Palestine after their pagan enemies, the Philistines. In 324 AD, the Roman Emperor Constantine became a Christian, and shortly thereafter, Jerusalem by mandate became a Christian city. This was the beginning of the Byzantine period, during which Christianity would flourish.
The temple has always inspired faith among Christians, even the lack of the temple. When the Byzantine believers from Europe came to Jerusalem and were there from the 4th century to the 7th century, the very ruins, the fact that the temple had been destroyed, verified Jesus' prophecy about not one stone shall be left upon another that shall not be thrown down. So it was faith building even then in its destruction.
After the death of Muhammad, the Arabs attacked Jerusalem in 637 AD, taking control of the Mount. 50 years later, they built the Dome of the Rock, claiming it to be a triumph of Islam in the Holy City, adding yet another mosque in 715 AD called Al-Aqsa. Inside the Dome of the Rock, the summit of the Temple Mount can still be seen. And in the middle of the summit, the rock. Today, lingering questions remain. Could this be the exact spot where Abraham offered his son Isaac, the very site of the threshing floor purchased by King David? Could this rock have been the center of God's dwelling place on earth, in the Holy of Holies?
The traditional Jewish view has always been that the rock inside the Dome of the Rock is either the location of the Holy of Holies or the place of the altar. And I do believe that, for example, the Temple Institute has completely accepted my findings that the foundations of Solomon's temple have been found on the rock.
Gershon Solomon is a strong supporter of the traditional view.
God himself pointed from the early times of the history, not only this land to be the land of the covenant, the land that God chose to dwell there, but he chose that this hill, the Temple Mount, Mount Moriah, to be the place where he himself will dwell, exactly as he commanded Israel. You will build me here a house, and I will dwell among you.
The Muslims feel quite differently about this site. They call it Haram al-Sharif, the noble sanctuary. Muslims believe that in 620 AD, the Prophet Muhammad visited Jerusalem in a mystical night journey from Mecca in Arabia. The Dome of the Rock, they say, marks the spot of his ascension to heaven. Adnan Husseini is director of the Islamic Waqf, Jerusalem, the Islamic authority in Jerusalem which oversees the Dome of the Rock.
And from this side, which is the site of the rock itself here, Muhammad were ascended to heaven to receive the instructions of the prayer. This place were named by God as Al-Aqsa, not by the Muslims.
And in that day will I make Jerusalem a burdensome stone for all people. All that burden themselves with it shall be cut in pieces, though all the people of the earth be gathered together against it.
The Temple Mount had already encountered the siege of the Babylonians, the Romans, and the Arabs. As history continued, it would be occupied even further by the Crusaders, the Mamelukes, the Turks, and the British. The Jewish people would once again be dispersed throughout the world. They would come to know the Holocaust. But the eternal flame would not die. The voice of the chosen people would not be silenced. The mayor of Jerusalem, Ehud Olmert.
Jerusalem was the walled city. And within the walled city, the heart of the city was the Temple Mount, which was the site of the two Jewish temples that were destroyed. So it was not just a symbolic gesture of enormous emotional impact, which it is, but it was also the site where the two Jewish temples existed and where they were destroyed by the enemies of Israel. Therefore, the return back to that place is the ultimate affirmation of our strengths and our vitality and our total commitment for our own future.
For I will take you from among the heathen and gather you out of all countries and will bring you into your own land.
After 2,000 years of dispersion, the Jewish people would once again return to their promised land. This time, with utter resolve, they would commit to a permanent homeland. On May 14, 1948, Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion uttered the proclamation heard around the world. We hereby declare the establishment of the Jewish state in Eretz Yisrael, the state of Israel. Ben-Gurion concluded his reading of the Declaration of Independence with trust in the Rock of Israel. Surrounded by a sea of Arab nations, Israel would be the sole democracy in the whole Middle East. The very day of its birth, Israel was attacked by every one of its Arab neighbors. The War of Independence was won, with Jerusalem officially divided. The Temple Mount in the heart of the Old City rested in the hands of the Jordanians.
You know, people are saying that the Jews should move off the Temple Mount, forget about it. Could this theme park become the sole representation of the temple in the world? After all, there was anti-Semitism even after the Holocaust. And from 1948 to 1967, when Jerusalem was divided, there were no Jews allowed at all in the Old City or anywhere near the Temple Mount.
On June 5, 1967, war once again broke out as Israel found itself surrounded by Arab armies. Historian Michael Oren.
55,000 Jordanian troops, 70,000 Syrian troops, 110,000 Egyptian troops, many thousands of planes and tanks and armored vehicles, all gathering in this sort of military noose around the state of Israel. Virtually the entire Israeli Air Force took to the skies and attacked the Egyptian Air Force at 19 different bases simultaneously, flying at a very, very low level. It's generally considered the most extraordinary air operation in history, and was remarkably successful. Actually, far more successful than even the Israelis anticipated. What wasn't planned was the conquest of the entire Sinai Peninsula. What was not planned was the conquest of the Golan Heights. What was not planned was an entry into the West Bank, and the liberation of the city of Jerusalem was just simply not planned and not foreseen by the Israeli government.
The war would last only 6 days. The Temple Mount and the Western Wall had been reclaimed. David Rubinger still visits the Western Wall. As a photojournalist, he continues to capture those fleeting moments of time, just as he did in '67.
For 3 weeks preceding that war, we had all lived in an atmosphere of total doom. And, well, take an example. I mean, Tel Aviv, the stadium was prepared to be turned into a burial ground for 40,000 people. It was only after the tremendous victory of the Air Force at 8 o'clock in the morning that the thing suddenly turned around.
It's 5:30 a.m. The Orthodox Jews scurry to the Western Wall for their morning prayers. They will read from the book of Psalms. Blessings are pronounced, petitions are offered, and a prayer is recited for the coming temple. Rabbi Menachem Froman wraps his arm in the phylactery and applies a box to his forehead containing the scripture from Deuteronomy 6. He reads from 1 Kings chapter 8 concerning Solomon's prayer of dedication upon the temple.
You are photographing me, but you don't see my heart. But it is there. And it is what gives me the capacity to speak, to be pictured. Perhaps you don't see this eager, this hope, this prayer for meeting God in His house, in the Temple Mount. But this is the heart of the whole phenomenon.
The Muslim prayer can be heard 5 times a day. In the little Arab villages surrounding Jerusalem, the devout gather to pray. They pray toward Mecca in Saudi Arabia, the birthplace of their founder Muhammad. Jerusalem is the 3rd most holy site to the Muslims after Mecca and Medina. On special holy days, over 200,000 gather to pray. They bow their heads and hearts toward their primary holy site, nearly 800 miles away.
We as Muslims, we have one spirit, only one spirit. It's the religious spirit.
Sheikh Abdullah Darwish is the spiritual head of the Islamic movement in Israel.
So I, as a Muslim world, our spirit is the Quran, Muhammad, Islam. This is our spirit. Without this spirit, we will die.
Mustafa Abu Shwai is the director of the Islamic Research Center, Al-Quds University, Jerusalem. Religion is one of the primary subjects taught here. Mustafa lives within the very shadow of the Temple Mount, and his rooftop affords a splendid view of the compound he refers to as Al-Aqsa. In the eyes of the Muslims, the long history of the Mount is quite different from that revealed in the biblical text.
What Muslims say that Abraham attempted to sacrifice Ishmael, and it's in Mecca rather in Jerusalem.
We say King Solomon was a Muslim. What means Islam? Islam means we are surrendering to God. King Solomon was too. All the prophets were Muslims, surrendering to God.
Historically, Islam is the youngest religions of the 3 monotheistic religions. And basically what they did was to adapt Jewish tradition and rewrite it, adjusting it to their own myth, I would say, or their own narrative.
Mor Alshuler is a senior fellow in the Shalem Center in Jerusalem. Her visits to the Western Wall are not as frequent as the religious Jews, but her faith remains unwavering in the biblical account of the Temple Mount.
According to that tradition, Muhammad took a ride on his horse, or divine horse, or an angel, and he just flew at night to Al-Aqsa, to this mosque, and he went up to heaven. But it was the Jewish tradition about the Temple Mount being the gates of heaven that enabled them, centuries and centuries later, to develop the tradition about Muhammad going up to heaven from this very spot. Now, Muhammad never set a foot in the Holy Land, never saw in his eyes the Temple Mount, and he lived, and he was a very creative and imaginative person. He was a person of God, but it was in the desert. So he and his followers adopted Jewish tradition and transformed them into Islamic tradition.
When the Israeli paratroopers liberated the Temple Mount in 1967, Defense Minister Moshe Dayan made a tactical decision that for many has remained a quandary to this day. He relinquished control of the Dome of the Rock and the surrounding compound to the Muslims.
To be smart means to sometimes restrain the implementation of your rights for the sake of peace and coexistence. And therefore we said we will pray in front of the Western Wall, and we will delay the implementation of our rights on Temple Mount for a more peaceful time.
Even Moshe Dayan understood it's a problem to hold it, because so many problems it causes. And we see till now, because there are two nations, two people who say, we want this area. One say Muhammad was here, and the other was said Solomon the king built this area, and it's a problem.
Laws of hospitality cannot be translated into rights. If I invite you to my home, once for dinner doesn't mean that you'd show up every evening at the same time. And this is exactly the nature of the problem.
The Temple Mount is the heart. As you can cut from a person the hands and the leg, whatever you want, but in the moment you touch the heart, there is a problem.
The problem became most apparent when Ariel Sharon visited the Temple Mount just before his election as Prime Minister. Sharon insisted it was his right to visit the holy site and proceeded through the small gate on the western side of the mount. Moving on to the western wall, he then read from the book of Psalms as the media clamored for position. David Dolan is an American journalist who has lived in Israel since 1984, when he covered the Lebanon War. More recently, his stories have covered events at the Temple Mount, such as Sharon's visit to the holy site.
Essentially, a riot broke out fairly quickly. He came up just before one of Israel's holiest days of the year, Rosh Hashanah, the Jewish New Year, saying he just wanted to visit the site. But the Palestinians, of course, saw it in a political way, and they were prepared beforehand with some stones and some other items, and they started throwing them at the police.
It's a book versus a book, it's a claim versus a claim, it's history versus history, but ultimately it boils down to physical being. The physical being, the structure there is a mosque. And this is really where the problem either ends or begins.
Gershon Solomon is the leader of the Temple Mount faithful. He limps from a war injury incurred when his leg was crushed by a tank in a battle with the Syrian army. In 1989, he and hundreds of like-minded supporters marched to the Temple Mount with what they hoped would be the cornerstone to the next temple. Their entrance to the mount was denied by the Israeli authorities, but they remain undaunted in their quest to restore the house of the Lord.
We are marching to the Temple Mount. We are making the battle for the Temple Mount. We speak to the Israeli nations. I travel to all over the world where I'm invited and to share the word of God and the big dream and the vision and the practical idea of the rebuilding of the temple. And I find in every place such a solidarity, such a strong support and the love.
Gershon Solomon is not alone in his mission to rebuild the temple.
We are actually starting to reproduce some of the vessels and garments which could be used in the third temple when it's built.
Here at Jerusalem's Temple Institute, Levi Chase.
We have over here is the crown for the high priest. The high priest would be wearing 8 garments. Engraved in gold is Kodesh LaHashem, which means holy to the Lord. It's made from 100 grams of pure gold. We have this silver piece, which its purpose is for gathering the blood from the sacrifice. It would go inside, it would be taken by the priest and sprinkled on the 4 corners of the altar.
They want to start building the altar first, and they have accepted my theory. They do sell my booklet, The Temple and the Rock, in which I've set out the location of the temple and the ark, and I believe that is the place they would like to start building the altar.
The golden menorah for the third temple is on display outside the Temple Institute and has become a popular attraction to local Israelis and tourists alike. It stands 7 feet tall. Also on display at the Institute are the priest's garments and the stones for the breastplate of the high priest. Computers have been used to generate the plans for various rooms in the actual third temple structure.
And there was given me a reed, like a rod, and the angel stood, saying, Rise and measure the temple of God, and the altar, and them that worship therein.
Background, what is the red heifer all about, and why is it so important?
The spokesman for the Temple Institute, Chaim Richman, and the mysterious ashes of the red heifer.
Cited. Well, according to Numbers 19, there is a particular type of impurity which pervades the world today, whose consequences are so severe that it can only be circumvented, and purification can only ensue through a process called the ashes of the red heifer.
Chaim has traveled all the way to a small Texas ranch to inspect a unique breed of cattle, which he feels may be an important link to the Third Temple. These are the red heifers, not presently found in Israel. If they are perfect, without spot or blemish, he believes their ashes could serve to purify the priests for service in the temple. Chaim asks for God's blessing. Jewish sources reveal that a mere 9 perfect red heifers were used in the whole history of the Jewish temple. By all modern reckoning, a perfect creature validated by rabbis has not been seen on earth for at least 2,000 years.
We are living now in a time of acceleration, in these times of the footsteps of the Messiah, and we realize that God is doing very great things.
And it shall come to pass in the last days that the mountain of the Lord's house shall be established in the top of the mountains, and shall be exalted above the hills, and all nations shall flow unto it.
Micha Harari and his wife Shoshana immigrated to Israel in 1982. They now fashion harps, much like those of biblical times.
Well, we're hoping that in the not too distant future, the temple will be rebuilt. And we feel that the way things worked out, that we were called here to bring the harp back to Israel. And if we're still around at that point, we hope to be making the instruments for the temple.
They had a huge orchestra. Children were trained from the age of 3 to play on the nevel, the kinnor, the cymbals, the shofar, and the silver trumpet, and they sang. And every day there were 2 sacrifices, and they never had any sacrifice without the sound of the harp. It just couldn't happen. They had to wait until it did. And then on the very big holidays, on Pesach, Shavuot, and Sukkot, it says that the sound of the harp was heard in Jericho.
This is the door of the holy place. And inside the hallowed Kodesh HaKodeshim, the Holy of Holies, where God dwelt among his people on earth. Once a year, the high priest would go into that room, make a sacrifice, and confront Almighty God. And the New Testament tells us that the hanging curtain, a very thick, heavy, like a fire curtain on a stage, curtain in front of the Holy of Holies was rent in 2 from top to bottom when the Lord was crucified.
The sacrificial shedding of blood has always been an integral part of temple worship. Its significance in the redemption of the children of Israel is clearly an important symbol in the annual remembrance of Passover. Gershon Solomon has reinstituted this solemn occasion on Mount Zion, overlooking the Temple Mount.
This event goes very deep to the deepest feelings, emotions, and historical events of the Jewish people. Unfortunately, the last year we could not make it because of the circumstances on the Temple Mount. The third temple will be rebuilt, and we shall sacrifice the Passover sacrifice on the Temple Mount.
According to Scripture, only those from the priestly tribe of Levi, or descendants of Aaron, were authorized to perform the sacred services in the temple.
And Eleazar, the son of Aaron the priest, shall be chief over the chief of the Levites, and have the oversight of them that keep charge of the sanctuary.
But is it possible, after 3,500 years, to be sure who is a descendant of Aaron? Dr. Karl Skoreski is a nephrologist and researcher at Rappaport Faculty of Medicine and Research Institute, Haifa. His recent DNA research has led to a peculiar relationship between science and the Kohanim, or priestly tribe of Levites.
We went and sampled individuals from Tunisia, Morocco, other countries in North Africa, Western Europe, Eastern Europe, eastward into Iran, Iraq, and even farther into India, Yemen, and descendants, North America, the United Kingdom. And the results were identical in all the communities. In other words, there was a high percentage, statistically highly significant percentage of similarity in the markers for Kohanim, irrespective of their current community of origin, indicating that they all came from a common founder.
DNA is the heredity material which all humans share. Slight differences in DNA among individuals are called markers.
We then went on to try to calculate the date of the founding of this dynasty using certain molecular biology tools combined with certain calculations and numerical tools in collaboration with colleagues in the United Kingdom who are expert in these kinds of calculations, and came up with a rough date for the founder of about 100 generations back, or somewhere in the 2,500 to 3,000 years ago, coinciding with the Temple period, possibly coinciding with Aaron himself or one of Aaron's descendants.
It's little surprise that the Muslims take issue with the Jewish thought of building a third temple. They deny, in fact, that a temple on the Mount ever existed in the first place. Here, at the Center for Contemporary Studies, Sheikh Salah Lufti stops for his prayer to Allah. He expresses his views on the temple in Arabic.
There are many Jewish claims about the alleged temple here. We think this is a theory. The Jewish theory about the temple there is full of contradictions. We're making a deep and thorough investigations about Al-Aqsa to reveal the contradictions of the theory and its incorrectness.
And they wanted to demolish 1,400 years building and existence just because they think about something called a temple. So this is the way of people, how think those people think here, and the others how they think. Those people leads for peace, the other leads to war.
2,000 years ago, when Christ was wandering in the streets of Jerusalem, what did he see? He couldn't see any mosque, because the first mosque was created only 632 years later. He couldn't even see any church, because when Christ was alive, there was no church yet. He could see only one thing in Jerusalem, the Jewish temple, because it existed long before anything else.
Still today we have heard from the Hezbollah leader, Nasrallah, that in 20 years Israel will not exist anymore. That is their aim. They say it in plain words. And for that, they have to say that there was never a Jewish temple, to destroy archaeological evidence, and so on.
The original temple site, of course, was the threshing floor of Araunah, the Jebusite. David purchased it from him. And in that same site, wheat is still being separated from chaff. The global implications of the argument over the temple site are with us every day.
Recently, the Muslims have expanded their area of worship on the Mount by digging underground in an area known as Solomon's Stables. The new mosque now extends over an area of 1.5 acres, making it the largest mosque in Israel, able to accommodate 10,000 people. Archaeologist Gabriel Barkay sifts through the discards of the Temple Mount.
Here in this valley, up here, we see a modern dumping area of debris which originates in an archaeological crime, in an excavation which took place upon the Temple Mount in November of 1999. Following that excavation, which was carried out with heavy machinery at the entrance to the so-called Solomon's Stables, the Muslim Waqf carrying out those excavations dumped the material from there with dozens of lorries which moved out the material from the Temple Mount, dumped it in different dumping sites. This is one of them, the main one.
The El Marawani Mosque was built suddenly, with no announcements, because it was the only way it could be done. This is the only way they work with the Israeli government. We have to impose things underground and then talk about it.
This carved stone found among the ruins dates to the Second Temple period and is thought to be part of a gate or lintel.
They are perhaps the most important archaeological remains that exist any place in the whole world. And this is not just an individual possession of the Jewish people that we are trying to protect. It's a possession of the culture of the world, of the heritage of the world that all of us want to be part of.
The goal is beyond any doubt obvious and clear. It is Islamization of the Temple Mount and creating facts, avoiding any civilized person from the world to have a say in what goes on upon the Temple Mount.
Contention for this holy site grows daily. Clearly, throughout the world, those who are in touch with biblical prophecy have their focus centered on the heart of Jerusalem and the mountain of the Lord. Far from Jerusalem, atop another mountain on the outskirts of Fort Worth, Texas, a congregation gathers to praise the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. The pastor, oil man Hayseed Stevens.
Whatever man can do, certainly God can do. Amen.
Like many other grassroots churches in America, the Living Way Church fervently supports a biblical view of the Temple Mount. In 1982, during his first tour of Israel, Hayseed met with Prime Minister Menachem Begin, who challenged him to drill for oil in Israel.
This is my 77th trip, and God has moved mightily. We have spent literally millions of dollars, and now, for the first time in my life, we have 200 square miles of leased land at the southwest end of the Dead Sea.
This is the area of biblical Sodom and Gomorrah, flourishing but sinful cities which were destroyed by God in a rain of fire and brimstone. It is the lowest elevation on earth. Israeli geologist Ephraim Aharoni.
This rock is impregnated with asphalt, and this means that oil was generated in this part of the world, in Israel, in the Dead Sea area. And the oil came apparently from several thousand meters depth and came up through fissures and cracks in the rocks and impregnated the porosity which is in this conglomerate. We talk about billions of barrels, possible billions and billions of barrels of oil in place here.
Hayseed is presently assembling a drilling rig and crew in a site located along the coastal plain of Israel. Although his efforts may appear unrelated to the issues of Jerusalem and the Temple Mount, he is quick to clarify the connection.
In Ezekiel 16:53, God says, "In the last day I will cause the fortunes of Sodom to return to you, Israel." And you know, oddly enough, I believe a lot of that money will be utilized to build the third temple.
The rebuilding of the temple is a key event for the end-time revolution, and if not in 67, it will be tomorrow, maybe a short time from now, but it will come to pass and no one can stop it. Not the enemies of Israel, not the long Arab occupation of the Temple Mount, nobody. God is determined to accomplish it. His end-time plans will come to pass, and I tell you, in the life of our generation.
I think we need a temple to have something manifest on the earth that we can relate to. God is everywhere. There's nowhere that God does not dwell in the farthest universes. But yet, being finite people, we need something to relate to. We need a way, a place to go to cleanse our hearts, to cleanse our sins, to have a community.
This is the place where the service of God performed by the priests of this holy nation has to take place. Period.
There are maybe a growing number of Orthodox Jews who believe that this crisis is coming to a climax. They're reading the same Hebrew prophets that many Christians are, that say that the final issue of history, the final battle of history will be over the city of Jerusalem. Something in this city will trigger it, and they believe it's undoubtedly the Temple Mount, as the evidence seems to indicate.
Shema Israel.
Shema Israel. Listen, Israel. This is the exact place of listening. For him to speak. Who knows? Perhaps he is speaking even now. Unless the noises of politicians, of rabbis, of sheikhs, of shooting, of stones. Perhaps we could hear him even now.
Now we want to be careful to explain that no one really knows how this third temple comes to be. We're not saying it's a discovery of Israeli oil or it's some act of God. But there are some clues. The Bible introduces us to the Antichrist, this elusive maker of false peace. The media will sure have a field day when the Antichrist announces that he is God. The book of Thessalonians tells us this announcement is made in the temple, and that establishes that there must be a temple of God at that time. The Bible has been accurate in 2,000 out of 2,500 prophecies so far, and the other 500 in the end times depend on the Temple Mount. It is key. Now, it's no accident that the temple site attracts attention. Forces on earth and in heaven grapple for it, as they grapple for every soul. You know, it's time to align yourself with the one who will keep you safe until the end. He said, "Look up, your redemption draweth nigh." Thanks for watching this program. And with the psalmist, let me say, Sha'alu Shalom Yerushalayim. Pray for the peace of Jerusalem.
This special program, as well as additional coverage of Jerusalem's Temple Mount, is now available on VHS. A clear presentation of the historic and prophetic significance of the most hallowed land on planet Earth. To obtain this timely perspective of Upon This Rock, call 1-800-WONDERS.